Welcome to this video about how to work one airplane that has multiple emergencies going on at once. For the record, I'm filming this on February 5th of 2021. I want to start with the obvious. So first of all, these can be challenging and stressful. I'm saying they can be challenging and stressful rather than they are challenging and stressful because compared to quote-unquote normal emergencies, A, a lot of those emergencies can be challenging and stressful on their own. B, in some cases, these can kind of simplify. And so in effect, they really should be, in some ways, no more challenging and stressful than any other emergency. So don't necessarily just give up the fight. Keep working the problem. Okay, and in many of these cases, it's actually going to be good to kind of slow the problem down if we can. And at some level, for an air traffic controller, this can actually be quite relaxed and actually fairly quiet in a lot of ways, even if there are some things to do. So you'll see that as we go through the video. But don't be too intimidated by the possibility of this happening. Fortunately, these are going to be rare. Most emergencies happen just, one problem at a time. However, there can be cases where there are more than one emergencies on a given aircraft at once. And when those happen, each one obviously will be unique. So that was all pretty much obvious. So let's jump into the meat of the video. This is why you're paying me absolutely no money whatsoever. Okay, here we go. So first of all, when multiple emergencies happen simultaneously with one airplane, I argue that there's two basic ways this will present. One is the everything at once thing. There's almost certainly, or I'm going to say probably, a related root cause, which may or may not be relevant. And by relevant, what I mean is, let's take, for example, and we'll look at a case of this later, where you have an airplane with 4 engines and you have a single engine failure. Well, at some level, a 4-engine plane that loses an engine, it's designed to do that, so to speak. And yeah, it's an emergency, but it's more of a pan in most cases, and so on. And that engine might be done for, so there's really nothing to do with it other than just fly it as a 3-engine airplane, for example. Okay, so the point is, it may or may not be relevant what the root cause was. You might not be trying to address the root cause. The pilot/flight crew might be having to address the causes, or the effects rather, of that root cause. There is likely to be a lot of confusion in many of these cases because pilots are getting multiple alerts and so on, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Emergency checklists, whether they're in paper form or electronic form in some of the more modern aircraft now, they're really designed to concentrate on only one issue, although there is some intelligence about how issues might cascade and so on. The problem is, though, when you have multiple emergencies happening at once, you tend to get stuff that just the checklists weren't designed for, okay? And so, for example, I've put up Apollo 13. I know that we are air traffic controllers, not space traffic controllers, and so on. But if you think about Apollo 13, it was an explosion of one of the oxygen tanks in the service module that caused all kinds of problems. And when the Apollo 13 accident first happened, and here you're fine to think about the movie with Tom Hanks, although Tom Hanks, he crashed and ended up on an island in Castaway. He was Sully, ended up on the Hudson. He's commander level in Apollo 13. I'm not sure we want to watch any more Tom Hanks airplane movies or flying type movies. Anyway, but Apollo 13, when it first happens, they're getting main bus A undervolt, main bus B undervolt. They're getting all kinds of problems going on, and there's a lot of confusion trying to just simplify and figure out what's going on. And the checklists weren't really designed, and so they had to kind of, in some cases, ad-lib the checklist and so on. So that's just going to happen. But most of that is on the flight crew. Very little of that is on the air traffic controllers, if any. And so as stressful and as challenging as this can be for the pilot or the flight crew, in almost all cases, while I do want controllers to do some stuff that's fairly intelligent, actually in a lot of ways what we're going to do is more or less pretty much sit back and relax and just kind of let the flight crew do their stuff while we get out of their way. And in fact, that's what I'd like controllers to do in many of these situations. All right, so let's go ahead and go on to the next part. As far as the other basic presentation, you can have a stable problem and then something else, and this may or may not be directly related to the root cause. So again, you could picture somebody who's VFR and IMC, and this might be somebody who is in that situation, and then they happen to have some other problem that has nothing to do with them being VFR and IMC. Okay, now we kind of have two problems. You're going to have to prioritize. It also can be the case that we're so busy with that VFR in IMC type situation that some other problem is caused, arguably, by the inattention to normal operations. So, for example, a lot of airplanes, every so often you need to switch which fuel tank you're running going on, and there's a certain procedure for doing it. If you have an emergency that gets going for a while and kind of occupies your attention, like some VFR and IMC kinds of emergencies can lead to, then the pilot perhaps gets out of his or her normal rhythm in addressing those kinds of things. And so it's a small thing, but basically if we have a GA airplane with some kind of emergency that's going on for a while, we might just think to periodically remind them to do whatever normal stuff they periodically do as far as switching fuel tanks and stuff like that. So that would be more in terms of prevention. But if for whatever reason that doesn't get done, you could have a VFR and IMC and they think they've got 2 hours of gas and suddenly they've run out of fuel. And they need to suddenly, switch fuel tanks and in other words, deal with something more pressing. It can just be a stroke of bad luck. They're dealing with one problem and another problem comes up, in which case you just have to prioritize and probably just A, keep the airplane flying, B, deal with whichever one appears to be most pressing. But there are so many variations, I'm not going to go into that in any more depth than that. Okay. So, some common root causes. I'm going to give you some quick examples of these. We're not going to go into any meaningful depth on these, but there can be various root causes that cause multiple emergencies to happen at once. We're actually going to do a separate slide with a fairly extended discussion about uncontained engine failures for turbine engines. So I'm just going to sort of table that for later. We're going to look at collisions. So when I say collisions, you might have first thought of midair, but bird strikes can cause multiple problems. For example, one of the first things that might come to your mind when you think of a bird strike is US Air 1549, Sully and Skiles' Miracle on the Hudson flight, and so on. I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact, though, that in collisions, whether it's with birds or whatever, you can have other problems, one of which is on rare occasions, a bird comes through the windshield and you have something like a pilot incapacitation event. I'm not going to go into it on any depth, but if you'd like to see an example of this, we'll keep this one real short. I'm just going to mute this and kind of skip forward. You're welcome to look at this AOPA real pilot story about the pilot of a Baron who had a bird come through the windshield. And if I can skim to just pausing on this picture, this is the actual airplane after he landed. The bird had come through the windshield. Later, the glare shield started kind of flapping up in the breeze, and the pilot had to try to reach up, even though he'd been blinded in one eye. And then the glare shield ended up flying off the airplane as well, and this guy had to make a rather difficult landing. Now, to be clear, he wasn't talking to ATC. But the reason I use this picture as kind of a guide here for the moment is if for the sake of discussion, he had been talking to ATC when this had happened, a lot of times what you're going to get is a lot of noise, a lot of confusion. And so when we get somebody who's maybe calling us and there's just this horrendous wind noise in the background, it could be something fairly simple, just like they lost the windshield, and that's been known to happen. Okay, it can be that there is other stuff going on. It's going to be tough for a controller to know, but just kind of keep in the back of your head that anytime you're hearing something with a lot of wind noise, there's a good chance that the pilot might have injuries, and we might be dealing somewhat with a pilot incapacitation event. This is not going to be a normal event where the passenger then is going to calmly get on the radio and ask for our help in landing the aircraft and so on. But if you have one of these situations with a lot of confusion, just kind of keep loosely in the back of your mind that the pilot might be up to his or her eyeballs and have physical injury and so on. We're not going to go into that any further. Air France Flight 4590 was the Concorde. And we will sort of tangentially come back to this later in the video. But Air France 4590 was taking off in Paris, and they ran over a metal strip that had come off a previous departing aircraft. When they ran over the strip right about the time they were rotating for takeoff, that strip caused a tire to burst, and the Concorde had a very high takeoff speed, and some of that tire rubber got flung up into the wing with the fuel tanks and so on at something on the order of about 300 miles per hour. And when that happened, that caused a number of problems. Basically, it shut down, I believe, the number 2 engine. It caused some brief problems for engine number 1, which somewhat came back, somewhat started to fail again. You've seen the pictures probably of the Concorde trailing out this huge tongue of flame out the left wing. There was a big fuel-fed fire as fuel was leaking out of the wing. And essentially, those pilots probably never had a chance in that particular case. But it speaks to what happens when you have, in effect, a collision, quote unquote, between the tire rubber and a piece of metal debris on the runway. And that shrapnel causes all kinds of problems. Engine failures, they couldn't retract the gear and get drag off the airplane in that case. Okay, fire and so on. And so collisions can cause all kinds of problems. I'm being sort of kind enough to not put up anything here about mid-air collisions. Obviously, that can cause multiple problems, and if you're having a really bad day, you could have two airplanes that go bump. Both of them are on your frequency for whatever reason, and you now have two separate aircraft with emergencies, each one with multiple emergencies, but you're just going to have to deal with that. No help from me, as it were. Sorry if I'm talking about that with a smile, but sometimes you just got to grin and bear it in these difficult situations. But collisions can be a common root cause for these kinds of multiple emergency situations. Structural problems. Aloha 243 was a 737 over Hawaii that had literally the front half of the roof rip off, and when it took out all kinds of wiring. It caused aerodynamic problems. I'm not going to go into further detail here, but if that happens, there can be a lot of confusion about what's going on, and the pilots in that case didn't know that half the roof of the airplane had ripped off in flight. They just knew they had a whole cacophony of problems. By the way, that was another one where there was a lot of wind noise, a lot of confusion, and so on. And pilots, when they get into these situations, they're going to tend to do one of two things. Some of these, and they probably have no choice in some of these, it's basically going to be, an immediate landing, and they really are going to come in, and we just have to clear everybody out of their way, and they're going to come try to land on the runway. We're going to roll trucks. You've got that figured out already. In other cases, though not applicable to, say, Aloha 243, they might be able to kind of get the airplane stable, and in some cases it will be prudent for the pilot or flight crew to just hold somewhere for a while, okay, holding pattern or perhaps vectors, and just hold for a while and sort of work through the problems. Each situation will be unique. Aloha 243 was a land pretty darn quick type of situation. Okay. You can have fires that lead to a cascade of problems. I won't go into the details, but Air Canada 797 was an in-flight fire in the lavatories where it started. That fire then started to burn through electrical wires that caused a host of problems with navigation radios. The transponder went offline, and next thing you know, controllers at Indy Center and Cincinnati Approach were issuing a no gyro vector on a primary target only aircraft, where the pilot also had a lot of distractions, including they lost the use of their pitch trim, and effectively the airplane was trimmed for cruise speed, and so as they were slowing for landing, there was a lot of muscle that was involved in trying to get the yoke back because they couldn't operate the pitch trim so that they could slow appropriately for landing. All right, again, that was another one that was a land pretty darn quick type situation. And then, oops, that should have been two separate things, but oh well. Engine failure causing systems problems. Here I've got two separate ones. One's Air Canada 143, also known as the Gimli Glider, the 767, and Air Transat 236, which was an Airbus 330 over the Atlantic. These two airplanes both ran out of fuel at cruise altitude. There are whole backstories about how they ran out of fuel and so on. Two different backstories for the two different flights. But ultimately, both of them ended up with dual engine failures. That's what happens in an air carrier when you run the darn thing out of gas. Not that it was per se the pilot's direct fault in the way you might think. And well, I don't want to get into whether it's the pilot's fault for running out of gas, but the point is they both ran out of fuel, okay, at cruise altitude and were descending for a while. And so, those engines are not only providing thrust, but they're also providing electrical power, hydraulic power, and while there are backup systems and there's something known as the RAT, the ram air turbine, that can stick out and help power stuff up, there can be some limitations on what the RAT can power. And so both of these flight crews, as they were coming in for landing, one in a little town called Gimli, the other one over the Azores, over the eastern Atlantic, both of them were having to contend with things like flaps and slats and spoilers not working or not working properly as they were coming in to land. And then there's another one, I'm kind of loosely calling this one Integrated System Architectures. And this was Air France Flight 447, and we'll come back to this one in a minute. But if you're familiar with Air France 447, this was the Airbus 330 over the Atlantic, okay, that basically ran into supercooled large drop droplets at cruise altitude about midnight up near the tops of some thunderstorms, and they kind of flash froze all their pitot tubes. So they had pitot icing. They lost their airspeed indication. However, some of these modern aircraft now are so computerized and so computer dependent that among the things that happened was this. Effectively, for Air France 447, they essentially had just one problem, and that was pitot icing, okay? But it led to such a cascade of different things going on with what I'm kind of loosely calling the integrated system architecture, that they were getting alerts about all kinds of things, and it was actually very confusing for them to drill down to the root cause. So the root cause of this one actually would have been relevant, where I say some of these, it's not. You just have to deal with the after effects of something like an engine failure. So we'll come back very briefly to Air France Flight 447. The point is, again, there can be a lot of confusion because maybe the root cause is irrelevant. You don't even know about it in some cases, like with the roof ripping off, or there's nothing you can do about it, like the roof ripping off, or darn things out of gas or whatever. Other times there's maybe something you could do that would essentially solve the situation, but it's tough for the flight crew to kind of cut through the cacophony and so on. There's going to be, frankly, very little that a controller could do with something like the Air France Flight 447. That one will come up when we talk about pitot icing, and maybe there are some things that we can do to help stabilize the situation, but the point is there's any number of things that can be common root causes. All right, let's talk just a little bit more about checklists, because this is an important part for controllers to understand. So first of all, as I mentioned already, checklists are not really designed for these kinds of situations where you have multiple failures, or ironically with that Air France, something like one failure that's leading to a whole cascade of things. And the reason that one led to a whole cascade of things is that pitot icing system, or that pitot system, is designed with sort of multiple backups, and they all got overwhelmed at once. Okay, and remember too that the modern electronic checklists and warning systems, they can be what I'm calling too helpful. On this, I want to take a brief look at an NTSB safety recommendation from the early part of 2019. It's a safety recommendation report 19-01, if I can just find it here. So this is called Assumptions Used in the Safety Assessment Process and the Effects of Multiple Alerts and Indications on Pilot Performance. Now, let me give you the background about why this came out when it did. You'll notice the two accidents cited were the Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines 737 MAX crashes. And at the time this safety recommendation report came out in early 2019, they were still very much working on investigating the accidents and so on. But here's why they put this out. It says, although the NTSB's work is ongoing based on preliminary information, we are concerned that the accident pilot responses to the unintended MCAS, MCAS is the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, that was the heart of the 737 MAX issues. The responses to that operation were not consistent with the underlying assumptions about pilot recognition and response that Boeing used based on FAA guidance. In other words, let me put that to you a different way here. So let me go forward a few pages here and pick up on page 10 in this section about system diagnostic tools. Doesn't that sound like fun? Okay. Multiple alerts, I'm going to start here. Multiple alerts and indications in the cockpit can increase pilots' workload and can also make it more difficult to identify which procedure the pilot should conduct. The NTSB notes that the Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines accident pilots' responses to multiple alerts and indications are similar to the circumstances of this completely separate type incident with the pitot icing in 2009 involving Air France Flight 447. Okay, and what happened was they were getting all kinds of things, and that was making it difficult for the flight crew to accurately assess what was going on. Going down to this next paragraph, starting down here, human factors research has identified that for non-normal conditions, such as those involving a system failure with multiple alerts, where there may be multiple flight crew actions required, providing pilots with understanding as to which actions must take priority is a critical need. This is particularly true in the case of functions implemented across multiple airplane systems, because a failure in one system within highly integrated system architectures, that's where I was getting that phrase in the PowerPoint slide about integrated system architectures. A failure in one system within highly integrated system architectures can present multiple alerts and indications to the flight crew, as each interfacing system system registers the failure. So if you get a single point failure in some of these integrated systems in a way that the designers didn't think would have multiple paths because of various backups, okay, you get this cacophony of alerts to the flight crew. That's to say nothing of how many alerts you get when you actually have multiple things going on from something like a collision or uncontained engine failure or something like that. Okay, the flight crew can just be almost overwhelmed. This is going to lead to one of the key takeaways for this. In these cases, in cases where pilots have multiple things going on and they want to go and hold for a while, controllers, please shut up as much as you can. The flight crew is overwhelmingly busy. That has to be our assumption while they are dealing with this stuff, and we have got to be quiet and let them take the lead. If we really have to ask them something, so be it. If we're in the dark about what's going on, I'm sorry, so be it. I know we're curious creatures. I know we're curious creatures in part because we want to help. But if they're really busy, just make clear, when you have time, we want information, and then shut up and let them deal with it the way they're in charge. It's up to them. It is not good if a controller is talking over and over and over again the way I tend to do in some of these videos. So let's move on here. Here's a good example of what to do and avoid something about what not to do. Also keep in mind that when they get into these situations, because the checklists are not really designed, pilots are going to have to ad-lib quite a bit. Again, I kind of picture loosely sort of what happened with Apollo 13. You know, they went to the lunar module as a lifeboat for a little while and having to rig stuff up and so on. So in some of these situations, pilots are just going to have to ad-lib and actually go off the checklist. Not to go to Sully and Skiles for the bazillionth time in this course and so on, but one of the things that's been noted about them is when they have the dual engine failure, you know, Sully especially, Skiles I believe as well somewhat, but Sully especially, you know, in effect had to go off checklist and just somewhat make stuff up because the checklists just weren't designed for that situation. Now, Sully was very pressed for time. However, if the airplane is stable, it might take a while, and the flight crew is going to be exceptionally busy for a long time. Okay. Let's move on a little bit and let's dive into some more uncontained engine failure situations, because I think this is one of the key ones for controllers to really understand. So first of all, uncontained engine failures, I'm going to argue, can happen in really any phase of flight. They can happen and have happened on the takeoff roll. Delta Flight 1288, I'm not going to discuss that one in detail here. They aborted on the runway. The turbine, the spinning turbine basically exploded. The engine was not able to contain the failure, hence uncontained engine failure. And the shrapnel killed 2 people. They aborted on the runway. Recently, in recent years, British Airways 2276, a Boeing 777, had an uncontained engine failure and a fire. They aborted the takeoff at Las Vegas. And American Flight 383, a 767, had something similar happen. I forget which one came first, but within a year, one way or the other, the British Airways 777 and so on. American 383 was at O'Hare. I will come back to some thoughts about American 383 in a little bit. That's why I've got that little asterisk there, because my memory's not very good. I got to have some kind of tag to remind me. Okay, it can happen during climb. We will go and look at these two. I guess that's what that means if I've got these tags up there. I've got a string on my finger telling me to look for tags. But Qantas Flight 32 is an Airbus A380 that was climbing out from Shanghai, from Changi, I believe is the airport pronunciation, in Singapore, when they had an uncontained engine failure, the number 2 engine. That engine sent shrapnel out in different directions, caused a whole cascade of problems. We will take a look at that. Also, there was an Antonov 124 cargo flight in Russia just a couple of months ago, as circumstances would have it, and I will, again, come back to that one as well. So far, I'm just really deferring on everything and just saying we're going to look at it later, right? But here, you had another uncontained engine failure. Shrapnel got sent out. It led to a cascade of things. That can happen on the takeoff roll during climb. It can also happen during cruise flight. I think it's less likely to happen as they're on approach, just because you're not typically running the engine at high power in those cases, but who knows. Takeoff and climb, obviously, you're at or near full power. During cruise flight, United 232, this was back in the late 1980s, the Sioux City Miracle, Captain Al Haynes had an uncontained engine failure of the number 2 engine. engine in the DC-10. When the shrapnel came out of that engine, it punctured the hydraulic lines for all 3 hydraulic systems. It caused some damage to the aircraft, not enough that made it unflyable, but because the hydraulic systems all lost all of their fluid very quickly, they had no meaningful way to manipulate the flight controls, and they had to use differential thrust on the remaining 2 engines to do the best they could to make it into Sioux City. The only thing I want to note there, and the reason for the star, is just because if you're not familiar with that one, I have done a case study video on this one already about United 232. I say that the Sioux City Miracle would have been an O'Hare disaster. They were on their way to O'Hare, and United 232, when they came in to land, they were having so much trouble steering the airplane because of these multiple problems that where really a controllability issue was the big thing. They ended up kind of cartwheeling off to the side of the runway into a cornfield. And so in that case study video about United 232, I argue that if we ever have a similar situation where controllability is in doubt, it would be prudent for us air traffic controllers to get other airplanes away from the runway environment and or do whatever we can to keep a plane like this from landing at one of these runways that's surrounded by airplanes filled with hundreds and hundreds of people and thousands of gallons of jet fuel. Also during cruise, just for the record, Southwest Flight 1380 in 2018, they were at cruise, had an uncontained engine failure. It sent some shrapnel into the fuselage, and unfortunately one passenger was killed in that flight. Okay, so let's go into just a little bit more detail here. Let's go back to American 383 for a second. So again, this was the 767 at O'Hare, and I want to look at a couple of things that are mentioned in the NTSB's full accident report for American 383. So first of all, let me just kind of scroll forward. I'm going to assume that you're at least loosely familiar with what happened. The number 2 engine had an uncontained engine failure. The right wing caught fire. They aborted the takeoff on the runway. Fire trucks were scrambled pretty quick. Passengers evacuated the airplane. Of course, half of them were taking their carry-on luggage, which is a whole other issue. But anyway, you can see the damage that was caused to the airplane. But here's the takeaway point that I would like controllers to remember about this one. At some level, for controllers, this is a fairly straightforward incident to deal with because the captain, the flight crew, they're saying we're aborting on the runway. We observe that they're on fire. We tell them they're on fire. We send the fire trucks, and at some level, it makes sense. All right, we're sending all the trucks for this airplane here. It's taking off, so it's clearly got a lot of fuel. Everybody else taxiing, just stop what you're doing. So just stop where you are. Okay, so the fire trucks can get there. But at some level, this isn't the most challenging incident for controllers to respond to. Here's something, though, I'd like controllers to think about in addition to that, and that is this. So let's go on a little bit more. And I want to start with this picture at the top of page 17. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. So they were taking off on runway 28 right, from right to left here as this picture's taken. And somewhere right about in here is where the uncontained engine failure occurred. You'll notice the NTSB says gouge in runway, and then very quickly they realize they're going to abort the takeoff. This is where the tire braking marks start. The airplane comes to a stop here. I got to if I pause that for a second, it brings up that little thing. Notice, though, that up here towards the north side of the picture, it says disc fragments B, C, and D. So there were 3 fragments of the turbine disc that were up here, okay, a little bit a ways from where the engine failure occurred. And then there's one way down here. It says disc fragment A. If I go to the text about this, okay, I'm going to start back on page 15. The high-pressure turbine stage 2 disc, okay, of the right engine was recovered in 4 fragments as shown in figure 5. About 96% of the disc, including the entire disc bore, was recovered. As mentioned in section 1.1, one disc fragment labeled A in figure 5, which weighed about 56 pounds. This thing weighs 56 pounds. It was recovered on the airport property in a UPS warehouse located about 1/2 nautical mile south of the airplane's position on the runway where the uncontained engine failure occurred. For what it's worth, if you look at figure 7 here and you see the pictures of the holes in the top of the wing, that 56-pound piece, which is this piece A over here in figure 5, came through the wing, okay, hitting things along the way, went through the top of the wing, went airborne for basically 1/2 mile, ended up hitting the roof, going through the roof, ending up on the floor of this UPS facility. That gives you some idea of the sense, or some sense of the idea, of what happens in some of these uncontained engine failures when you send a 56-pound piece of shrapnel, through multiple layers of the aircraft, and it lands a half-mile away and still goes through the roof. Okay. For what it's worth, B, C, and D was actually just one piece when it came out. It was going in a downward direction, hit the runway so hard it gouged the runway. It broke apart into different pieces. The biggest piece, fragment B, weighed about 83 pounds, and that one ended up, I'm not sure, but about a quarter mile away from where the uncontained engine failure occurred. So you're getting pieces that are 83 pounds, 56 pounds, quarter mile away, half mile away. Controllers, if we ever have an uncontained engine failure, whether they abort on the runway or maybe they're rolling down the runway, have the uncontained engine failure just a few seconds later, they stagger off into the air. Okay, I know that tower controllers, even though I'm just a center dude, but I know that tower controllers are doing FOD checks after airplanes have engine failures. Okay, but at least some thought to be given for the possibility that if it's an uncontained engine failure, you might have pieces go in a variety of different directions, and it might be prudent to make sure that we do not have any more departures until any runway that's going to be used for a departure is specifically checked. And it may or may not be prudent to use some common sense and think about where pieces might have gone. Once we get everybody stopped for taxiing, make sure they assess that they didn't get hit by any debris, and then make sure that they just are vigilant for FOD as they're taxiing out. So I don't want to get too crazy about this, about just making everybody stop for the next 3 weeks while we check the entire area. But you do want to use some common sense about it, because these pieces can go in a variety of places. Qantas Flight 32, we're going to look at the Australian version of the NTSB. This is the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, and there's 300 pages of thick reading. We're just going to touch on the first few pages here. So first of all, the Australian NTSB version, I forget what it's called, found that a large fragment of the turbine disc penetrated the left wing leading edge before passing through the front spar into the left inner fuel tank and exiting through the top skin of the wing. The fragment initiated a short-duration, low-intensity flash fire inside the wing fuel tank. However, the conditions were not suitable to sustain the fire, so that fuel fire in the wing tank extinguished pretty quick. Another fire was found to have occurred thanks to oil leaking. It lasted for a short time and also self-extinguished. Okay, a large fragment also severed wiring looms inside the wing leading edge that connected to a number of systems. A separate fragment severed a different wiring loom located between the lower center fuselage and body fairing, and that loom included wires that provided redundancy for some of the systems already affected by the severing of the wires in the leading edge. This additional damage rendered some of those systems inoperative and led to a whole cascade of confusion up in the flight deck with these electronic checklist systems known as ECAM in this particular airplane. The hydraulic and electrical distribution systems were also damaged, which affected other systems not directly impacted. I mean, And, who knows? Again, every situation will be different, but you have an uncontained engine failure, there can be all kinds of problems. Sometimes they will just want to return right away and just get the thing on the ground. That's pilot's prerogative. Other times they're going to do like Qantas Flight 32 did, and they're going to hold for a while. So if we kind of look at one more set of sections here. So while the flight crew continued to process the ECAM messages, that's the ECAM display, that's that, I forget what all these acronyms are, but that's basically the alerting system. While the flight crew continued to process the messages and the procedures, the second officer went in the cabin to visually assess. This is almost my best part. As the second officer moved through the cabin, a passenger, who was also a pilot for the operator, brought his attention to a view of the aircraft from the vertical fin-mounted camera that was displayed on the aircraft's in-flight entertainment system. That display showed a fuel leak from the left wing. So I just picture the second officer going through the cabin, got a passenger kind of waving his hand, trying to get his attention, says, yeah, I'm an off-duty Qantas pilot here, and look at this. On the in-flight entertainment system, the tail-mounted camera, you can see the fuel leaking. It's a unique way to find out about problems, I suppose. They would have figured it out anyway. But, okay, but they realized they couldn't transfer fuel, they couldn't jettison fuel because they had these wiring problems and so on. And by the way, just FYI, again, every situation will be unique. It took a little less than an hour for them to complete all the initial procedures associated with the ECAM messages. Okay, so sometimes they're just going to hold for a while and just deal with it, and they are so busy. Controllers just, try to stay out of their way a little bit. Among other things it caused, inoperative wing leading edge lift devices, reduced braking function, reduced number of operational spoilers, inactive left engine thrust reverser, and so that was going to change the way they did the landing and so on. And I've highlighted these in green because I think this is absolutely wonderful to note. This is a fantastic piece of airmanship. Prior to leaving the holding pattern, the crew discussed the controllability of the aircraft and conducted a number of manual handling checks. The crew determined that the aircraft remained controllable and advised ATC that they required a long final approach to runway 20 center. And then the flight crew progressively configured the aircraft for the approach and landing and conducted further controllability checks in each new configuration. I love that idea of controllability checks. And so and this is one of the takeaways for controllers, if we have pilots who go and hold for a while because they've got all kinds of multiple problems, whether it's uncontained engine failure like this or something else, I think one of the few things that controllers should ask pilots about is whether they will be conducting any controllability checks prior to coming in to land. And actually, I'd like to word it diplomatically because it's entirely possible that the flight crew is doing this on their own. I suppose it's also possible that they hadn't really thought about it just with all the confusion and cacophony of stuff going on. And so I think maybe the diplomatic way for controllers to phrase this to the flight crew is just advise us before you do any controllability checks and tell us how it goes or something like that. Again, wait till they're coming out of the hold and going to start working their way back. And I think that's diplomatic enough that if they were going to do those controllability checks anyway, they can just tell us that it's going fine, or they can tell us whatever. They're going to, just leave the flaps up, whatever they're going to do. Or it might be that they hadn't even thought about doing controllability checks, which should be rare for an air carrier type crew. But supposing for the sake of discussion that they had, not even thought about that, and we say just advise us about the results of any controllability checks you do, that flight crew, they're going to look at each other and go, ooh, I think we should do that. So I think that's a good thing to do, and that's why I've colored that in green. Just a couple more things here. Events on the ground following the landing, just kind of an FYI. Again, with all the electrical problems, they had some radio difficulties when they shut it down, and they actually couldn't shut off the number one engine. They recycled the engine master switch to off. They press the engine fire button, the fire extinguisher bottles in an attempt to shut down the engine, and normally that's like a guaranteed way to shut the engine down because you're killing the fuel supply, you're killing other things to it, you're dumping fire extinguisher in there. This was also ineffective, and the dang thing continued to run. And if you read about the evacuation, about 13 minutes after they landed, they decided that they wanted stairs brought to the aircraft. It took a little while for the stairs to get there. People started exiting about 50 minutes after the aircraft touched down. It took about an hour for the full disembarkation to take place down the one set of stairs, partly because they were being very careful about it. In the meantime, that number one engine is still going on. They tried a number of things to shut it down. They activated a series of circuit breakers. They reconfigured the transfer valves in the external refueling panel to transfer fuel away from the engine. Nothing worked. And finally, they decided we're just going to have to drown the darn thing with water and foam. And so it was shut down about 3 hours after the aircraft landed. That engine was still running the entire hour that people were exiting out the air stairs that had been brought up to the aircraft and so on. So again, just an amazing situation, but that boggles the mind that it made so much damage that they couldn't shut the number one engine down for about 3 hours. Okay, and then the last of these we're going to look at is what I'm calling a recent Antonov 124 flight in Russia. And so let's go look at this one. And what we're going to look at here is an article in the Aviation Herald, which is a bit of an eyesore, but is usually very good information and so on. This took place just on November 13th of 2020, so just a couple of months ago from when I'm filming this. They took off from Novosibirsk, Russia, on their way to Vienna, Austria. However, they had an uncontained engine failure, the number two engine, at about 1,000 feet ATL. By the way, the highlighting here is not mine. I can't do anything about it. So it caused all kinds of problems. If you go down and look at some of the pictures of the pieces, you get pictures of the shrapnel damage up into the fuselage and so on. But among other things, and I have to find it here, I'll go to this part here. In a videotaped interview, the captain of the flight reported that the number 2 engine blew up at about 1,000 feet AGL just after gear retraction with the flap still extended for takeoff. Debris damaged the aircraft's cabling and took out all electrical supply, resulting in the loss of all electrical systems, including instruments, brakes, thrust reversers, etc. Now, it did remain controllable despite all of the electricity gone and all communication, even intercom having failed lost. The crew attempted to establish visual contact with the tower, but were not successful. They came back in pretty quick and landed on runway 25 anyway, with very little margin due to low altitude and engine thrust. But after touchdown, the overrun was unavoidable due to the loss of brakes, spoilers, thrust reversers. A couple quick lessons from this. So number one, it's a generic reminder that generally speaking, the rule of thumb is if an airplane can get down and slowed, even if it goes off the runway, that's pretty survivable, even when it's an airplane that's pretty heavily loaded and they've basically got no brakes and very little steering. There's no audio with this one. And I believe this is cell phone footage, if I'm not mistaken. It might be security camera footage. But again, that should be survivable, and it certainly was survivable in this case, and so on. But this highlighted section down here talks about some of the problems that they had. And then also, just for what it's worth, engine number 1 also ran for 3 hours after landing. So tongue-in-cheek, if we have a 4-engine airplane and there's a single engine that has an uncontained engine failure, you might as well just assume that one of the other engines is going to run for about 3 hours. That just is pure happenstance and so on. But on this particular one, they came back very quickly and they were going to have steering and controllability issues. So maybe just kind of one last takeaway about this as we come to the summary slide for this video. So first of all, for controllers, slow things down if the flight is stable for now. Some might elect to come back or practically be forced to come back right away, okay, either from cruise altitude or just after takeoff, like that Antonov 124. If they are going to go and hold for a while, they are exceptionally busy. They really have a ton of checklists to do. So controllers, just let the flight crew take the lead about everything, including communication. And for what it's worth, if the flight crew elects to hold, I would prefer to see controllers have them hold rather than controllers issue vectors. And the reason for that is controllers are going to have to vector, and then we're going to have to vector them again, and vector them again, and vector again, kind of box them around, keep them in our airspace, whatever. And we're going to have to interrupt them every couple minutes. And they are going to be so busy, and they're going to be ad-libbing checklists rather than just running through them methodically in some cases. And if we're just every 3 minutes or so, giving them a new heading, that's a big distraction for them. If they get the hold, they can set that up, and that's far easier for a flight crew like this. And so, by all means, if they want to hold, give them a hold. If they don't request a hold, but they just want to kind of go somewhere for a while, offer to hold or vector, whatever their choice is, and obviously whatever they choose is what we'll do, and so on. But let them take the lead. Don't try to press them for too much information while they're running their checklist. As they're getting done, okay, and again, so we've maybe had 15, 20, 50 minutes, whatever, to kind of think about. We then might ask them if they can give us a digest version of the overall sense of the situation, along with whether they've done any what their controllability checks are. Also, just for uncontained engine failures, not for cruise flight, but for anybody who's aborting on the runway or it happens right after takeoff, I want you to think seriously about whether debris, including big metal pieces, have gone just anywhere you could possibly think of, scattered left and right from the engine failure point forward, okay, on the airport grounds. They might end up on a taxiway. We might have FOD. It's a small likelihood, but there's a chance that some of those pieces hit an airplane that was taxiing on a different taxiway for a different runway and damage that other airplane. Just keep that in the back of your head. And again, if you think about where that could have gone, we could have FOD on other runways and so on, in addition to potential FOD on the runway that was used by the airplane with the engine failure. So if a plane returns, and this is the last thing, if a plane returns, and I kind of have in mind, I'm sort of picturing like that Antonov 124 sort of merged with what happened with United 232, the Sioux City flight. If a plane returns, especially right away, and remember the Antonov was never talking to ATC, we don't know if they've got controllability issues or not. That Antonov was not able to brake, and they had some steering problems, although I believe they were able to keep it on the runway itself until they went off the end. Okay, if we ever have a plane coming back like this, and especially if we're not talking to them, we don't know what's going on, it might be prudent to get everyone else scattered away from the runway if you can. If a plane is coming in with one of these controllability issues and they lose steering control at about the time they're touching down and they go off to the left or right, and we've got a bunch of other airplanes sort of stacked up in that area, God forbid that happens. That's going to be one of the worst aviation disasters ever, because you've got multiple aircraft involved and a lot of fuel. You've got planes taxiing for takeoff. So just sorry to sound macabre here and kind of end on a sour note, but just for these uncontained engine failures, there is so much confusion that can go on. It can cause so many problems, including controllability issues. Pieces of debris can go in a variety of places. That's among the things you might have to think about. So these absolutely can be challenging, but for some of them, at least when it slows down, controllers can actually kind of take a break for a little while, let the crew be busy without us interrupting their thought process, and then we'll just ask them a few questions about controllability and the situation as they're sort of exiting the hold and coming back into land. Thank you, and I hope we never have to use this stuff.